Support for College Matters comes from T-Mobile for Education, the trusted connectivity partner helping colleges and universities modernize, innovate, and stay connected for what's next. Visit T-Mobile.com/highered to learn more. This is College Matters from the Chronicle.
It could complicate the way you measure their success, meaning how you grade them. Do you give them a second chance on an assignment or not? Do you grade them on effort or not? And what's striking to me about this report is the suggestion that Harvard overcorrected to deal with those challenges.
With an undergraduate admissions rate of about 4%, Harvard University is, unsurprisingly, among the most selective institutions in the country. Once admitted, though, Harvard students often seem more interested in building social networks than grinding it out in their classes. That's no big deal, though. Most of them are acing their courses anyway. That's the conclusion of a much-talked-about new report from Harvard's Dean of Undergraduate Education, who says grade inflation has gone too far at Harvard College, which is home to the university's undergraduate program. Now, the report says, the problem is so pervasive that it's undermining the college's academic mission. But does this report matter beyond Harvard's hallowed halls? To talk about that, we're turning to my colleague Beth McMurtry, a senior writer at the Chronicle of Higher Education, who writes about teaching and learning. Beth, welcome back to College Matters.
Thanks, Jack. It's good to be here.
Well, I appreciate you coming. When this Harvard report came out, I immediately thought, I need to talk to Beth. I need her to explain this to me, so I appreciate you coming.
I'm looking forward to talking through all of this.
Yeah, so I have some thoughts of my own that I want to share, but it would be great if you could guide us into the report. What does it say exactly?
The report examines undergraduate grading and student workload, and it concludes that Harvard's current practices, quote, are not only failing to perform the key functions of grading, they are also damaging the academic culture of the college more generally. So that's quite a statement. First, what it does is it outlines the problems. In 2025, A's accounted for 60% of grades in Harvard College. That's up from 40% in 2015 and just 24% in 2005. And this creates what's known as compression, meaning that the range of grades is narrowed. And that makes it difficult to differentiate the highest achieving students from their peers. It's also having all kinds of ripple effects. According to the report, it's actually increasing stress for students because anything less than an A feels like they have failed. At the same time, it makes an A feel rather unexceptional, so that's a bit paradoxical. And then students also end up putting more of their energy into other activities to help distinguish themselves, which pulls them away from their coursework. And it's putting a lot of pressure on instructors to award A's because the students expect them and might revolt or just never take a class if an A isn't seen as a given. We should also note that this is the third report Harvard has done since 2023 on what it calls recentering academics after the pandemic. The first report documented this grade inflation. The second one found that students were disengaging from their coursework. And this is an effort to dig into how Harvard got here and what it should do next.
As you say, this has been something of an object of obsession for Harvard. They've covered this ground before, but it's just one university. It's a big university, but is this a big deal?
In the larger scheme of higher education, maybe not. In the national dialogue, definitely. Harvard College only enrolls 7,000 students out of about 15 million undergraduates in the U.S., so we're talking about a tiny fraction of the population. But as we all know, Harvard has outsized stature and influence in our culture and our society. So when something happens at Harvard, that becomes part of the larger narrative around higher ed. And right now, that narrative is that the value of college is inflated. Students aren't challenged like they should be, and the goal becomes the credential. So this report could reinforce that perception. But there's also, I think, another equally important reason why this report matters. A lot of the challenges they describe here are actually very common in higher education, and they should be talked about and addressed. For example, professors do feel a lot of pressure to grade more leniently than they might want to, and we can talk about reasons for that. And there's also a big debate in higher ed about whether moving away from grades as the end-all be-all would actually help students learn better. Jack, I know you were eager to talk about this report. What interested you?
Well, for the same reasons you described, Beth, I think we're all interested in Harvard to some degree. But as a reporter, my obsession has always been about money and power in higher education. And even though this is ostensibly about teaching and learning, I see this report as a report that's also about money and power. And I'll unpack that a little bit. Harvard is really a power production factory. You can say it perpetuates privilege, but you can't argue that its function in our society, at least for now, is to serve as sort of the proverbial sorting hat for who's worthy to fill some of the most consequential positions in our country. I mean, 4 of our 9 Supreme Court justices have degrees from Harvard. All but one, Amy Coney Barrett, have degrees from an Ivy League institution. And in this report, Harvard is essentially screaming, we've not done a very good job of sorting, I guess, the somewhat talented among us from the super talented among us, and that's part of our function. The money piece is interesting to me, too. Harvard has an endowment of $52 billion. It is loaded, but people within the university are still fighting over resources like they do in any organization. And increases in enrollment are key to unlocking those resources if you're at Harvard. And the report says, I'll quote from it, faculty also know that they are competing with one another for students, end quote. So more students can mean more faculty lines for your department, more grad students, more students majoring in your field of study. And if you want to gain a reputation as a place that's welcoming to students, a good way to do that is to give A's. There's another piece of this that I think is related to money and power, which is career advancement. So the report spends some time talking about how non-tenured instructors fear that low scores will hurt their teaching evaluations, and in the words of the report, limit their job prospects. Tenure-track faculty think giving low grades will hurt their tenure chances. And then students are motivated by career concerns as well. They're thinking about whether their grades are going to unlock different doors for them, but they're also thinking about, hey, Harvard is literally the social network place, right? There was a movie with that title. So they're thinking about what's more important, working hard in my class or developing these potentially lucrative career-advancing social networks. And so they're engaging in a lot of extracurricular activities. They're spending a lot of time with their peers. This is actually not only fun, but it could help them in their career advancement. So I see this report as saying some really interesting things about money and power in addition to teaching and learning. But I'm curious, Beth, do you think I'm on anything here? Am I overplaying this? Is this report saying something more fundamental about Harvard as a power production factory or all the perverse incentives that money creates? What do you think?
Well, I do think we have very different takeaways from this report, which probably reflects, as you note, our backgrounds as journalists. You go after the money and power, and I'm looking at the day-to-day teaching and learning dynamics and what happens in and around the classroom. So I agree that this report reflects things that are specific to highly selective institutions like Harvard, which hold themselves out as the standard bearers of excellence. And that's why a central dilemma of this report is the question of how you determine who is truly exceptional if everybody is getting A's. And that matters when your students are aiming for the country's top graduate programs, PhD programs, law schools, medical schools, or they want to secure that highly competitive job on Wall Street. They want to get the top academic prizes. But there's a lot more to this report, I would argue, that is not unique to Harvard, although it may seem like that at first glance. So I can understand why you read some of it and think it's maybe a little more nefarious than it seems like it is to me. For instance, there's a section in there about how students are increasingly combative over grades. And I'll read you a couple of lines from the report. This is a quote. Students also exert pressure in grading. Sometimes the pressure is direct, as when some students challenge their grades or take an increasingly litigious approach to every assignment. At other times, the pressure is indirect, with some advisors advocating inappropriately on students' behalf. Now, I think we can picture the sort of Harvard student who thinks he's entitled to an A or may threaten that his dad will sue the college.
I'm picturing this person.
Yeah, they probably showed up in the social network.
Right.
But I don't believe that's actually what they're describing here. I have talked to so many professors across all types of institutions about how today's students are much more comfortable arguing over grades or pleading with them to change their grades. We could have an entirely separate conversation about the changing student-professor dynamic that says nothing about Harvard and everything about how Gen Z has been raised. And I would say that's not necessarily because they think they're entitled to a grade. It could be because they were raised to advocate for themselves, or they might think it's okay to push back against their professor's judgment. Or it could mean they messed up and they're asking for a second chance. Or it could mean they're panicking because if they fail the class, they'll have to add another semester on to college.
Yeah, there are some strong sort of generational elements in this report that we should talk about in terms of how colleges dealt with the pandemic, how they're dealing with this changing student population. But what about faculty? Isn't this report, going back to my money and power thesis, isn't this report showing that professors are motivated to give higher grades in part because they're thinking about their own personal career advancement or their department budgets?
Yes, but I would argue, where are they not?
Mm,
It's true that professors and departments compete with one another for students and resources. That's just how higher education budgets are structured. And grading may play into that. So if it's true for Harvard, which is incredibly wealthy, you can imagine it's even more true for the 100% of colleges that have less money than Harvard. I did think it was noteworthy that even at Harvard, some professors wondered whether the administration would, quote, have their back if students complained about their grades.
mm.
And let's not forget that 70% of faculty members today are contingent, meaning they work on a contract. And if nobody signs up for your classes because you have a reputation as a tough grader, you could be out of a job. That's a modern day economic reality.
Yeah. Talking about students, though, and their experience, there's a lot in here that suggests these students are just incredibly stressed out and unsure about how to navigate college as a result. How does that square with your own reporting more broadly on higher ed?
Well, it's the exact same things I've been reporting on for years now. This is a generation that has been raised to see education as a commodity, frankly. They are in college, or they are told that they need to be in college to get the degree to climb the economic ladder. There's very little discussion about the meaning and purpose of their education or seeing college as a chance to explore and figure out what they want to do. If everything becomes about external achievement, about getting the grade, that leads, I think, to some really natural tensions that we're seeing in students today, particularly in students at these highly selective colleges, where they really feel like they can't afford to screw up. So they tend to be really cautious in the choices that they make. They tend to choose majors that will give them a leg up economically. A disproportionate number of graduates from highly selective schools tend to go into finance and consulting. I find it very hard to believe that your average 18-year-old is deeply interested in consulting. And they also spend a lot of time, again, not just at Harvard, thinking about their resumes and what kinds of internships and jobs they need to put on these resumes so they can get that first job. Now, of course, at Harvard, it's going to be the consulting club. At a less selective college, it's going to be a different set of extracurriculars. But I think every student today knows they need to sort of play this game. But I do
And they've
not
been
think—
playing it. They've been playing it their whole lives, right? That's how they got into
Yes.
Harvard in the first place.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we can also have another conversation about the way in which they are educated in high schools, where they are sort of taught to perform well on tests, SATs, admission tests, so on and so forth. So again, these students are a product of their environment. And I would not say this is a particularly carefree generation of students. The Harvard Crimson ran a story about the report and about students' reactions to the report. And one student described it as soul-crushing, and they said that they spent their whole entire day crying, they skipped classes, and they were sobbing in bed. And they said, I feel like I try so hard in my classes and my grades aren't even the best. So the student is reflective of a generation that has learned to ask, how high should I jump?
Yeah, I read that article, and I also noted with interest the online backlash to this. People on social media were going really crazy on this. The one student you mentioned who said she was crying and skipped class. And this is where that term snowflake comes into play. It was interesting to see the author of the Harvard report, Amanda Claybaugh, who's the dean of undergrad education. She essentially confronted this head on. She said it's not true that students are snowflakes. At the same time, the report does give some credence to the idea that faculty, for a variety of reasons, might have gone soft on these students. What do you make of that?
So this is the part of the report that I find the most fascinating. It describes the pressure coming from administration for faculty to be more aware of students' life circumstances. It notes that some students coming in may be less academically well prepared than their classmates. They might have a difficult family situation, and some are struggling with imposter syndrome. And nearly all of them, as we just talked about, are suffering from stress. So think about the professor-student relationship of a couple of generations ago, like that very traditional image. And this represents a real shift. Back then, back in the day, professors were not asked to think about their students' lives outside of the classroom. They weren't expected to factor in how different students might come into college with different levels of academic preparation that probably mapped onto their economic circumstances. Now they are being asked to consider all of this at Harvard and elsewhere. That is a heavy lift. It's not intrinsically problematic. You can still evaluate how well a student does in a course while also being supportive of them, but it could complicate the way you measure their success, meaning how you grade them. Do you give them a second chance on an assignment or not? Do you grade them on effort or not? And what's striking to me about this report is the suggestion that Harvard overcorrected to deal with those challenges. So one of the questions it asks is whether modern methods of teaching work against student performance. So for example, in the old days, you might have a midterm and a final or a final paper. So these really high-stakes exams on which everyone was essentially measured against each other. Now we're moving toward more frequent, lower-stakes assignments. Do those effectively evaluate whether students have mastered the material, that they comprehend everything you've taught? Or, for another common example is if you allow students to do a more creative project rather than a traditional paper or exam. Again, a lot more professors these days are doing that to motivate and engage their students. It becomes much harder to evaluate one student against another or to determine which students get A's, which students have mastered the material. And a lot of universities have struggled with these kinds of teaching challenges. There's even a movement that they mentioned in the report toward alternative grading that has gained converts. And the idea is that traditional grades demotivate students to learn for the reasons we've been talking about here. But if you give students, say, feedback instead of a grade, then the hope is that they'll read and respond to that feedback and will want to work toward improvement. Sometimes that works really well, and sometimes it doesn't.
We'll be back in a minute. Today's higher education leaders are rethinking connectivity, from hybrid learning and research collaboration to campus-wide digital transformation. That's where T-Mobile for Education comes in. As a trusted partner to colleges and universities nationwide, T-Mobile delivers scalable, secure connectivity built for innovation, resilience, and student success. Learn more at tmobile.com/highered. There's a big philosophical debate, I think, underneath all of this, Beth, which is college about helping students to master material, which you might argue a bunch of low-stakes tests might help you to do, or is it about putting people in these high-stress pressure cooker environments where they go in and take the big test and 40% of your grades on the line and you got to stay up all night? I mean, that's kind of the old school definition of academic grit.
Right. I think there's a lot in there that Harvard is wrestling with, that a lot of professors are wrestling with. For example, if you want all of your students to learn the material, why not let them try and try again? Why do one high-stakes test and say, well, you got a C, let's move on? You can see the pros and the cons of that, right? Or why would you say only a certain number of you deserve A's if a lot of your students come in, work really hard, are very creative and productive, and they show different forms of mastery of the material?
I think the response to that, Beth, and Becky Supiano, our colleague, and I kind of joked about this relative to physicians. You know, I don't want a physician practicing on me. They get one shot at this,
Yes.
If they're surgeons. So that would be, I guess, the argument here. There's an idea here that grades are just inflated broadly, not just at Harvard, but across the country. And Becky and I did talk about that a little bit. But what's your sense of that as a problem that's being identified within higher ed?
Well, like you said, we know that grades have increased nationally, and we have data showing that they've been going up since the 80s, and average GPAs have gone up, and A's have become more common. So the phenomenon is real. I will say it's hard for me to evaluate how much the general public cares about grade inflation, because I feel like every family wants their own children to do well in school. And
But those aren't inflated grades.
No.
That's a clear representation of how well Max is doing in school, Beth.
Right.
I resent this.
And even in K-12, there is a discrepancy between how well teachers and administrators think students are learning and how well parents think their students are learning. And then there's the complicating factor of during the pandemic, which, again, going back to why Harvard started doing these reports, there's a lot of sense that we need to reset from where the pandemic left us. But during the pandemic, we saw K-12 schools getting a lot more lenient with grading because they wanted the kids to stay in school and not drop out. But I do think the general public, or at least parents, are aware that some of these pandemic-era practices backfired in ways. So, like, students did do less work objectively. School absences stayed high even after the return to in-person teaching. So there is, I would say, common ground that we need to get back to some basics, like making sure students are showing up for their classes and stick to deadlines. What I hear in higher education, though, from professors is when they are not grading as rigorously as they would like, it's often out of fear. They worry their colleagues are going to judge them if they grade their students more harshly, particularly if they're both teaching, say, the same subject, and one is known to give C's and one is known to give A's. Students are actually very aware of that as well. And they also worry that students will give them bad course evaluations. If they're adjuncts, that's going to affect whether or not they get courses the next semester. But I will say, too, that sometimes that fear is amorphous, and that's where it gets really tricky because I've had professors tell me that they sometimes pull back on giving a student a lower grade because they're worried about their mental health, or they project this fear that if they lower their grades, they might get a call from an administrator saying, what's going on here? So the tension I see right now is that there is a call from some politicians and perhaps some employers to more rigorously vet students and ensure that an A means a student is excellent in that course. All that said, I think there's a far bigger worry in higher education right now that keeping enrollments up and the lights on are the priority. And that could work directly against stricter grading policies.
Yeah, and I think the report is fairly clear that at least the dean of undergraduate education at Harvard thinks that grade inflation is afoot here. There may be other reasons why grades go up, but given that that's sort of the consensus, where does Harvard go from here?
Well, yeah, that's a really good point because she noted that most faculty perceive that there is a misalignment between grades awarded and the quality of student work. So if faculty are feeling that, how do you kind of execute on that? The report is pretty blunt in noting that other elite colleges have tried and failed to do this. They even list examples from Dartmouth and Wellesley and Yale and other places. Some of them tried capping the number of A's, others published median course grades, and nothing stuck. So what Harvard is suggesting is this multi-pronged approach, which addresses the multiplicity of factors that are fueling grade inflation. So one is this very specific idea of allowing faculty to award a limited number of A-pluses to distinguish the very best students. That, to me, only really addresses the very specific problem of sorting, kind of those backroom conversations that you were talking about earlier become more transparent and clearer, publicly clearer to who is truly the top of the top. Another idea is to reset the average. So they're asking faculty to review their own grade distribution over time, essentially is like, please fix it. You should take this challenge on. The report notes that students often feel that they are being graded on effort, and that's not necessarily what professors think they should be graded on. So that's a real miscommunication. So one way to recalibrate and then to talk to students about that is to say, you know what, I'm going to put less weight on attendance and completion and more weight on exams. A third suggestion is to reward teaching that they call, quote, rigorous and meaningful. And I assume that's a counterweight to the pressure that professors feel to do well on student course evaluation. So in other words, students aren't the only ones that are going to have a say in whether or not you teach effectively.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. As we started off, we're talking about a very small subset of higher education and society. Whether Harvard gives out a few A-pluses probably isn't going to change many people's lives. But there are grander themes, as you say here, and Harvard is laying out a map of how it's going to address them. As somebody who covers teaching and learning for the Chronicle, what are you going to be looking at over the next 6 months or so that might come out of this?
I wonder if we have reached some sort of tipping point on grading. As we've talked about, professors have been asked to be many things to their students, mentors and guides, as well as teachers. And a lot of people like those roles. They like the fact that their students are more open with them and they can be more open with their students, and they want to get their students excited to learn and help them. But there are so many tripwires along the way. Like if a student isn't motivated, for example, and they just don't put in the work, what kind of grade are you willing to give them? Some professors feel like they're failing if their students are floundering, and others are really frustrated when they want to grade more harshly, but they feel like they'll be penalized. And then you add AI to the mix, and nobody really knows what's real anymore. So where do we go from here? Do we return to these more narrow and quote-unquote objective ways of evaluating students, like final exams? Will colleges truly feel pressured to reduce the average grade, to increase their credibility with the public and with employers? And if they do that, will they then be blamed for not graduating more students? It's a complicated equation.
No doubt. Well, one we will continue to follow, Beth. Thanks so much for coming on the show and talking to me about it. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Also, Jack, what would you grade me?
I only have a limited number of A+ I can give out, Beth, so we'll think about it.
Okay. I would honestly give you a B, but because I really want to come back again, I'll probably give you an A+.
All right. Fair enough. Thanks a lot, Beth. College Matters from the Chronicle is a production of the Chronicle of Higher Education, the nation's leading independent newsroom covering colleges. If you like the show, please leave us a review or invite a friend to listen. And remember to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts so that you never miss an episode. You can find an archive of every episode, all of our show notes, and much more at chronicle.com/College Matters. If you like, drop us a note at collegematters@chronicle.com. We are produced by Rococo Punch. Our Chronicle producer is Fernanda Zamudio Suarez. Our podcast artwork is by Cottrell Thomas. Special thanks to our colleagues Brock Reed, Sarah Brown, Carmen Mendoza, Ron Coddington, Joshua Hatch, and all of the people at the Chronicle who make this show possible. I'm Jack Stripling. Thanks for listening. Support for College Matters comes from T-Mobile for Education, the trusted connectivity partner helping colleges and universities modernize, innovate, and stay connected for what's next. Visit T-Mobile.com/highered to learn more.